Greetings to all of you from Arab Center, Washington, D.C. This is Khalil Jahshan welcoming you to this very special, actually, webinar, which is a keynote conversation with Dr. Stanley Michael Lynk regarding the international human rights community and Israel crimes of apartheid. We will introduce the speaker in just a minute. Let me just make a couple of introductory remarks, and then we'll proceed with the program as scheduled. As most of you know, on March 22nd, 2022, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the occupied Palestinian Territory submitted a report to the UN Human Rights Council, UNHRC, concluding that the situation in Israel and the occupied territories amounts to apartheid. This, of course, comes, as we all know, on the heels of mounting reports by international and Israeli organizations labeling Israeli policies as apartheid, including, of course, our colleagues at Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, and others. While Palestinian human rights organizations, have been referring to that for years, have been calling the situation in Israel vis-a-vis the Palestinians apartheid, these reports represents a growing international consensus that Israeli authorities are committing apartheid against the Palestinian people under their control. So Arab Center Washington, D.C. has essentially organized this special webinar with the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Palestinian territory since 1967 to discuss his specific mandate as Special Rapporteur, his report's findings, the process he pursued, the methodology, and the evidence collected throughout the process. Today's conversation will include a discussion of international law, the legal frameworks for the definition of apartheid, global and political reaction to the report, the significance of this consensus forming in the international human rights community, the application of international law in this context, and what possible steps and legal and political actions can be taken in light of the conclusions of the report and the recommendation of the rapporteur. Let me now shift gears and introduce our special guest. Professor Michael Lynk was appointed in 2016 by the United Nations Human Rights Council as the 7th Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied in 1967. Dr. Lynk is a Canadian legal academic and associate professor of law at Western University in London, Ontario, where he teaches labor law, constitutional law, and human rights law. He also served as associate dean of the Faculty of Law at Western University between 2008 and 2011, and taught labor law courses at the University of Ottawa, Carleton University, and Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. Before becoming an academic, he practiced labor law and refugee law for a decade in Ottawa and in Toronto. He worked for the United Nations on human rights and refugee issues, including Jerusalem. Professor Lynk has written widely on all these topics and specialties of his in Canada and other international publications, including topics pertaining to the Middle East conflict specifically. He has largely acted as a labor arbitrator in Canada. He speaks frequently at labor law and industrial relations conferences, and he has advised governments and international organizations on labor law and human rights issues. Professor Lynk has his BA degree and LLB from Dalhousie University and completed his LLM at Queen's University back in 2001. In 2015, Professor Lynk was named to the Mayor of London's honors list for his work on humanitarian issues. Professor Lynk is supposed to speak to us for about 15 minutes or so. And then we will go ahead and start a discussion with him, a conversation, if you will. I'll ask a couple of questions, but then quickly we will try to, as much as possible, dedicate the balance of our time to you, our audience. We appreciate so many of you joining us today. I looked at the list. It's more than 250 registered people for this event from various parts of the world. We welcome all of you. So good morning or good afternoon or good evening to all of you today. And we look forward to having a fruitful discussion with our special guest. Please feel free to send your questions during the presentation anytime, either to basically through the Zoom mechanism at the bottom of the page. You can enter your questions there. I'll be able to read them and convey them to Professor Lynk. Otherwise, you can email him at email@arabcenterdc.org, email@arabcenterdc.org, and staff will enter them where I can see them. And I would be more than glad to convey your questions. Please make them short, avoid long comments, and we will be glad to convey as many of your questions to our guest as possible. With that said, Professor Lynk, the microphone is yours. Please go ahead. Thank you for joining us today.
Dr. Yanshin, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you to the Arab Center for inviting me to speak today about my latest, as it turns out, my last report as a UN Special Rapporteur. If I can just take a minute to explain what a Special Rapporteur is. There are about 55 Special Rapporteurs with various human rights mandates that are appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council based in Geneva. Most of these special rapporteurs have a global mandate: the special rapporteur on food security, the special rapporteur on the right to water, the special rapporteur on the right to be free from torture. There are about a dozen of us who have a specific geographic mandate: the special rapporteur on human rights in North Korea, the special rapporteur regarding Myanmar, the special rapporteur, myself, with respect to human rights in the occupied Palestinian Territory. We're autonomous from the Human Rights Council. We're not paid for our work. We keep our full-time jobs. And most of us, unsurprisingly, would be university professors who have both the expertise in the particular area for which they've been appointed, but also they have, I guess, a job that will support them and allow them to devote the time necessary to be a special rapporteur. I was told when I took the position 6 years ago that I would have to find 15 months in every year in order to be able to stay on top of both my work as a legal academic as well as my work as a special rapporteur. Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, has called special procedures, which is the grouping that encompasses the special rapporteurs, as the crown jewel of the human rights system within the United Nations. If the audience will forgive me, I'm going to read my comments, because I want to make sure that I've got everything precisely put in front of you, and I'm hoping will take approximately 15 minutes, and then I'm happy to answer questions from you for the remainder of the hour that we have. I am completing my 6-year term as Special Rapporteur at the end of this month. The past 6 years that I have served as Special Rapporteur have been momentous in regards to developments in the occupied Palestinian Territory. Alas, most of these developments have been disheartening and an affront to our international human rights practice. There have been several intense periods of destructive violence, great loss of life and property against the Palestinians under occupation by the Israeli military, particularly in Gaza during the Great March of Return in 2018 and the short explosive war in Gaza in May 2021. The Israeli occupation, with 55 years, now in its 55th year and with no end in sight, has become even more entrenched and more repressive. In terms of Palestinian deaths at the hands of the Israeli military, 2021 was the deadliest year since 2014. The instance of settler violence towards Palestinians in 2021 was the highest recorded since statistics were first assembled in 2014, and the demolition of Palestinian homes by the Israeli military has also been spiking continuously upwards. In 2014, when the last serious peace process collapsed under US Secretary of State John Kerry, there were around 370,000 Israeli settlers living in the West Bank. Today, there are close to 480,000 settlers, an increase of 23%. Add to that the 230,000 Jewish Israeli settlers in Jerusalem, and there are now more than 700,000 Israeli settlers, over 10% of the Israeli Jewish population living in occupied territory in settlements that the UN Security Council has deemed to be, and I'm quoting, a flagrant violation under international law. And in terms of Palestinian civil society and international human rights observers, the news is equally discouraging. In October 2021, Israel designated 6 leading Palestinian civil society organizations as terrorist organizations, and has not rescinded this attack, notwithstanding the consistent statements by many member states and international donors that Israel has not presented persuasive evidence to back up any of its claims. The dedicated theme of my 12th and final report as Special Rapporteur has addressed the question as to whether Israel's acquisitive and repressive practices over the course of its 55-year-old regime has curdled from an endless occupation into something darker, harsher, and more ominous. In recent months and years, distinguished voices have concluded, excuse me, that the inexorable facts of Israel's occupation, the relentless land confiscation, the ever-expanding Jewish-only settlements, the dual legal and political system, the vast gap in living conditions between Israeli settlers and the Palestinians living among them, the vast separation in political rights, torture, home demolitions, collective punishment, and the depleted Palestinian economy have amounted to or resembles apartheid. Former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon wrote in 2021 that Israel's structural domination and oppression of the Palestinian people through indefinite occupation arguably constitutes apartheid. Nobel laureate Desmond Tutu stated in 2014, and I quote, "I know firsthand that Israel has created an apartheid reality within its borders and through its occupation." And the former Attorney General of Israel, Michael Ben-Yair, who was Attorney General in, I believe, 1993 and 1994, wrote in February that Israel's ongoing domination over the Palestinian territories is a gross injustice that must be urgently rectified. It is with great sadness that I must also conclude that my country has sunk to such political and moral depths that it is now an apartheid regime. It is time for the international community to recognize this as well. And he continued, "You simply cannot be a liberal democracy if you operate apartheid over another people. It is a contradiction in terms because Israel's entire society is complicit in this unjust reality." So my report asks, has this 55-year-old occupation curdled into something worse? Applying the accepted 3-part test taken from the 1973 UN Convention Against Apartheid and the 1998 Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, I concluded in my report that the political system of entrenched rule in the occupied Palestinian territory satisfies the prevailing evidentiary standard for the existence of apartheid. First, an institutionalized regime of systematic racial oppression and discrimination has been established. Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs in East Jerusalem and the West Bank live their lives under a single regime which differentiates its distribution of rights and benefits on the basis of national and ethnic identity, and which ensures the supremacy of one group over and to the detriment of the other. The differences in living conditions and citizenship rights and benefits are stark, deeply discriminatory, and maintained through systematic and institutionalized repression. Second, this system of alien rule has been established with the intent to maintain the domination of one racial, national, ethnic group over another. Israeli political leaders, past and present, have repeatedly stated that they intend to retain control over all of the occupied territory in order to enlarge the blocks of land for present and future Israeli Jewish settlements, while confining the Palestinians to barricaded population reserves. Under this particular system, the freedoms of one group are inexorably bound up in the subjugation of the other. And the third part of the apartheid test is whether there's been an imposition in this system of institutionalized discrimination, with the intent of permanent domination through the regular practice of inhumane acts? I say that it has. There is arbitrary and extrajudicial killings, torture, the violent deaths of children, the denial of fundamental human rights, a fundamentally flawed military court system, and the lack of criminal due process. There's arbitrary detention. There is collective punishment. There is the desperate living conditions in barricaded Gaza. The repetition of these acts over long periods of time and their endorsement by the Knesset and the Israeli judicial system indicates they are not the result of random and isolated acts, but they're integral to Israel's system of rule. This is apartheid. It does not have some of the same features that were practiced in Southern Africa before the 1990s. In particular, much of what has been called petite apartheid is not present, i.e. the pictures that we're all familiar with from apartheid South Africa of separate benches for white and black populations, separate water coolers, separate elevators, and so on. But on the other hand, there are pitiless features of Israel's apartness rule in the occupied Palestinian territory that were not practiced in Southern Africa, such as segregated highways, high walls and extensive checkpoints, a barricaded population, missile strikes, and tank shellings of a civilian population, and the abandonment of the Palestinian social welfare to the international community. With the eyes of the international community wide open, Israel has imposed upon Palestine an apartheid reality in a post-apartheid world. As I conclude, I want to address one of the most important and neglected issues dealing with the Israeli occupation of Palestine, the remarkable unwillingness of the international community to impose any accountability measures on Israel for its forever occupation, which has been conducted both in absolute defiance of international law and with the eyes of the international community wide open. The UN Security Council has adopted over 30 resolutions in the past 50 years, critical of the Israeli occupation. The General Assembly and the Human Rights Council have adopted hundreds more resolutions. According to international law, the Israeli settlements are illegal, annexation is illegal, the denial of Palestinian self-determination is illegal. Human rights abuses are rife. The Fourth Geneva Convention applies in full and has been denied by Israel. None of these countless resolutions have been obeyed by Israel, and nothing has been imposed on Israel to bring it in compliance with the rules-based international order. When the international community allows a member state permission to go rogue, it is going rogue itself. I would not be here in front of you in this audience today presenting and talking about my most recent report on how an unrelenting occupation has metastasized into apartheid if the international community had taken its own rules seriously 40 years ago or even 30 years ago, when the Security Council and General Assembly were adopting the first of their many resolutions critical of the Israeli occupation. International law is not meant to be an umbrella that folds up at the first sign of rain. Had the international community accompanied these resolutions with resolute accountability and consistency decades ago, in the same way that it's doing today with great urgency, respecting the invasion and occupation of Ukraine, then we would have most likely have already had a just and durable resolution to the question of Palestine years ago, and nobody would be talking about apartheid today. In closing, I want to echo the words of Albert Camus, who once wrote that, and I'm quoting, "Calling things by their wrong name adds to the affliction of the world," unquote. It is important that we recognize that this occupation has become indistinguishable from apartheid, but it's even more important that we insist that the international community, particularly North America and Europe, impose the necessary accountability measures to end the occupation and to realize Palestinian self-determination. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Professor Lynk, for your introductory presentation here. And let me begin the question and answer while we're beginning to get some good questions from the audience. Let me take advantage of my participation here as a facilitator to ask the first one. And I noticed this morning in the media, related, not quite directly addressed at you, but you're of course familiar with the criticism that you report has generated both in Israel and out here in the US and Canada. You referred to your own government's reaction, and I agree that we've had a similar one a little bit to the south of Canada. The American reaction has also been shameful. Both governments refuse to even accept the term, the applicability of the term apartheid to the Israeli case. But the media this morning reports a group of pro-Israel NGOs in response to the investigation, if you will, by different UN agencies, including yours, that you participated in, which we take, of course, into consideration your own description of it as being an independent effort and so on. But they submitted 2 million complaints that they classify as essentially discrimination, examples of repression of Jews and violations of their human rights to the UN Human Rights Council in an attempt to intimidate, if you will, or to stop any investigation like the one you just conducted. Could you comment on the overall reaction, if you will, the attacks, the personal attacks that you sustained after the report, and this particular effort, which is not really focused on your report, but at any rate, it's significant.
Sure. To be special rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territory is to be on the receiving end of a steady stream of abuse with respect to this. It's something that I paid a lot of attention to very early on in my special rapporteurship when I first was appointed in 2016. But I came to realize that there's no particular way of satisfying these groups. They have a professional basis to oppose any criticism of Israel. I call them pro-occupation groups because they've never raised in any of their human rights analysis any reliance upon either international law or upon UN resolutions, which have said this is an occupation. It is prolonged. It must end. It's rife with human rights abuses. The settlements are illegal. Annexation is illegal. None of that bothers them. So we're in different universes when it comes to the human rights lens we each claim to use. I know that there is great concern by Israel with respect to the appointment last summer by the Human Rights Council of this permanent UN Commission of Inquiry into the root causes with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So in many ways, they have what the Human Rights Council did in creating this new Commission of Inquiry was to create a body that has a much wider jurisdiction than I do. My jurisdiction as a special rapporteur is only within the occupied Palestinian territories, the territories occupied since 1967, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. I have several part-time staff assisting me, so I have very little resources in the work that I wind up doing. I'm pleased to see that this Commission of Inquiry was appointed. It has advantages over mine. First of all, they have it's permanent. It has staff, I believe, around 14 or 15 staff members, and they are to look at, I suppose, any issues with regards to the root causes of the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. So they have a wider geographic basis. They have a longer time basis than I do, and they have more resources than I do. So I'm hoping and expecting for very good things coming from them. I don't know, I hope, but I don't know if they're going to address the issue of apartheid. I know the Israeli Foreign Ministry is quite worried that they will issue a report at some point with respect to this. My sense is that I hope that they will, because of the volume of reports that have come out that you mentioned in your introduction. Not only is it Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and the Special Rapporteur who have issued recent reports on apartheid, but it's also Palestinian groups like al-Haq and al-Mazan, and it is Israeli groups like Yashdin and B'Tselem, and as also recently, there's an excellent report that came out of the International Human Rights Clinic at the Harvard Law School in February or early March with respect to whether apartheid exists in the occupied Palestinian territory. So in the last 2 years, there's been an avalanche of reports coming to this. I can understand the fear of those who protect or defend the Israeli occupation as to this new conversation that's beginning to occur, and I welcome it. Obviously, I wouldn't have written my report if I didn't think it was a legitimate issue to wind up raising, and I just hope that this continues, because as I said in my quote from Albert Camus, it's important to call things by their right name if we're going to be able to properly diagnose them and then cure them.
We received a question couple of minutes before your just recent statement from Paul Welsh. He was asking, which you did answer the first part, is Gaza under your mandate? Mm-hmm. And you did answer that, but he's asking the second part of the question: isn't the blockade of Gaza an act of war?
The blockade of Gaza is, and I've said this in one of my previous reports, amounts to collective punishment. Collective punishment is unthought of in the modern world. You know, it's basically punishment without crime. You're punishing somebody for what someone else had wound up doing. Collective punishment is expressly forbidden under the Fourth Geneva Convention, which governs occupations. And of course, I agree, as does the international community agree, that Gaza is part of the occupied territory, even if Israel removed its troops and removed its settlers in 2005. What Israel has maintained is the closure of Gaza, and in fact, a formal blockade has existed since 2007, 15 years. The international community has called for on repeated occasions for the lifting of the blockade, for the allowance of freedom of movement by Palestinians in Gaza. You show me any other place in the world where there is a substantial population, in this case 2 million plus Palestinians, where another alien rule has blockaded and imprisoned, if you like, this population. On a regular basis, I've spoken to young Palestinian writers and artists in Palestine who are all in their 20s and 30s. They all are studying or have completed university studies in Gaza, and they're interested in finding expressive literary and artistic ways of telling what life is like in Gaza. And I remember asking them at the end of one of my conversations, there probably were 35 or so young Palestinians on the line. I said, how many of you have ever left Gaza? And of the 35, there were 3 who had actually been allowed to leave Gaza and go elsewhere and then come back. And I'm sure if you ask that to the percentage of the entire population, it would be something similar, is that, you know, the vast, vast majority of Gazans have never left the Gaza Strip because they're not allowed to, because Israel and Egypt wind up controlling the entrance and exits going in and out of Gaza. There is no other comparable situation like this in the modern world. Indeed, we can extend that, if we would, to the West Bank as well, where the 2.7 million Palestinians living in the West Bank live within blockaded enclaves of disconnected land, 165 separate pieces of land, which are separated from one another by Israeli highways, by Israeli blockades, by Israeli military checkpoints. And that space in which the Palestinians live in the West Bank, and as well as the 360,000 Palestinians living in East Jerusalem, is only getting smaller and smaller as the confiscation of land by Israel continues to grow. So, but I want to make sure I also say this with respect to Gaza, because Gaza gets entirely underreported, even when it comes to Israel and Palestine. You know, the most recent figures coming from the World Bank is that there's a 50% unemployment rate in Gaza, a 60% of Palestinians in Gaza live under the poverty line, and 80% of Palestinians are dependent in whole or in part on some form of international aid to be able to survive as a family. The Palestinian economy in Gaza is flat on its back. The healthcare system is in crisis. There's virtually the drinking water, or at least the one coastal aquifer that Gaza sits on. 97% of the water is undrinkable and contaminated because of either seawater or sewage has seeped into it. So most Gazans have to depend upon very expensive water produced by the desalination plants that are there. The 50% unemployment rate that I quoted from the World Bank, this is the highest unemployment rate of any economic unit that the World Bank regularly winds up monitoring. If we say that the Palestinian economy overall is flat on its back, I think the Palestinian GDP per capita is around $3,200 American per person, but it's vast. There's a vast difference between the West Bank and Gaza, where the GDP per capita in Gaza is around 12 to 1,300 American dollars per year per person. So Gaza is only kept alive by the, if you like, the artificial resuscitation coming from international aid, either through the UN or from a few Arab states such as Qatar. So we should never forget that when we talk about the occupied Palestinian territory, most of the focus is on East Jerusalem and the West Bank, because it's easiest probably for media to be able to access that. But we have a dire situation in Gaza, which we don't hear enough about.
Thank you very much. If I might add just a personal note, I mean, when you talk, as Paul mentioned in his question, is it an act of war, the blockade on Gaza? It's also a state of war. I mean, last night it just happened by chance, about 7 o'clock Washington time, PM. I received a call from a cousin of mine in Gaza to chat. He calls at least once a week. And we were talking, it was about 2 a.m. His time, and suddenly he said, "Sorry, Khalil, I need to hang up because the sirens are up. We hear Israeli jets up in the air, and they're about to bomb. I need to take the girls to a safer part of the building." And he did hang up, and immediately on the news, we heard of additional bombing of civilian areas in the middle of the Gaza Strip. So let's move to the next question. It's from Martha Gutenberg. She refers to a bill that was passed recently in the US Senate, Senate Bill 3999, that would prevent the US government in the future from funding Amnesty International or its employees. Are you aware of these types of reaction in the midst of the larger kind of response that you refer to? I think this shows a systematic, not just symbolic rejection of the finding of apartheid and other crimes, isn't it?
Yes, I agree. I mean, I'm not aware of that particular bill, though I must say my understanding is that Amnesty does not take money from governments. It has different sources of public fundraising that it relies upon, but it doesn't take money from governments so as to allow it the freedom to be able to criticize governments through their reports. So that Senate bill is, you're right, probably symbolic, but it may not have any practical impact with respect to the continuation of Amnesty's work. You know, may I say, you know, just to salute the bravery of organizations, the Palestinian, the Israeli organizations that I've mentioned who've come to the conclusion of apartheid, as well as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty. Both the Amnesty and the Human Rights Watch report are detailed. They use, I think, the right legal framework based on international law with respect to apartheid. And I found that their reports were rigorous and were fact-based. So I commend them to everybody. I think you'll need a little bit of patience. I think the Amnesty report is over 200 pages, and the Human Rights Watch report is, I believe, over 100 pages. So put aside an evening or two if you're going to wind up reading them. But I think you'd find them to be persuasive analysis, and which give you a rich understanding of what is going on. If you want a shorter version, well, there's always my report. My report, I think, is only about 18 pages long and about 10,000 words.
Thank you. I think related to Martha's comment or question, back on the 29th of March, 68 senators, imagine 68 out of 100 US senators, urged Secretary of State Blinken to help end UN inquiry on Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So it is not just symbolic, I mean, and not just rejection of what's going on, but an attempt to even stop international, responsible international reaction to what's going on.
Yeah, if I can just comment on that. Anthony Blinken, when he gave a speech at the beginning of March of 2022 to the Human Rights Council, and he said that there were 4 areas of importance to the United States at the Human Rights Council. And the first 3, I think are admirable. He said, we're going to work with other countries that we don't necessarily agree with in order to find common solutions to human rights issues in the world. Secondly, he said, we're going to work to strengthen economic, political, and cultural rights in the world. Third, he says, we're going to be fighting on the side of vulnerable people. And I agree with all 3. But he said their 4th priority was to continue to counter anti-Israeli bias and the unfair and disproportionate focus on Israel at the Council, and in particular with respect to the Commission of Inquiry. And I find this to be quite regrettable. The United Nations is sometimes criticized by those who support the Israeli occupation, that it has passes more resolutions on Israel than in any other particular conflict in the world. I think the issue is not the number of resolutions that are passed by the United Nations with respect to Israel, but the degree of accountability which the United Nations and the international community hold Israel to in disobeying those resolutions. If we are decrying now the Russian invasion and occupation of Ukraine and saying we need to defend a rights-based international order, well, it begins with other places, and certainly it begins with respect to Israel and Palestine. There is no other conflict in the modern world where the international community has spoken at such length, in such volume, and with such rigor with respect to the application of international law to a ungovernable occupation. And yet, we have this huge gap between promise and performance. And some have said that in the Middle East, international law is now closer to power than it is to justice. And it's a sad conclusion I have to come to as a lawyer and a legal academic, that there's a great deal of truth with respect to this. I think at the end of my 6 years now as Special Rapporteur, I believe as strongly as I've ever believed with respect to the efficacy and the importance of international law. I'm a little bit less starry-eyed about the fact that citing international law is going to wind up changing minds when it comes to power centers in Washington or Brussels or London or Paris or Berlin when it comes to the Israeli occupation of Palestine.
Thank you. Abdelhamid Siam basically says, Mr. Lynk, you raised in your reports, briefings and press conferences, the issue of accountability. If Israel is not being held accountable for its actions, it will continue doing these atrocities. Can you detail how Israel can be held accountable and kind of link that to your recommendations and conclusions?
Sure. Let me just raise this. In June of 1980, almost 42 years ago, the UN Security Council passed a resolution, Resolution 476, and I urge any of you to go take a look at it. It won't take you more than a minute or two to find it on Google and more than a minute or two to read it. The resolution said 2 important things. First of all, it reaffirmed, and I'm quoting, the overriding necessity of ending the prolonged occupation of Israel over the Palestinian territories. This was in 1980 after 13 years of occupation, already calling it a protracted occupation, already saying it had to end. And the second thing that the Security Council resolution said was that it's, and I'm quoting again, it strongly deplores the continued refusal by Israel, the occupying power, to comply with the relevant resolutions of the Security Council and the General Assembly. So already, if I guess my question to political decision makers, and I've said this often to them, if you said 42 years ago that the occupation was already protracted and prolonged and had to end, what do we call an occupation now after 55 years? It's, John Kerry in his closing speech in the end of December 2016 as Secretary of State called this a forever occupation, a permanent occupation, an indefinite occupation. Though to an international lawyer, those are oxymorons. You cannot, it's a unicorn. You can't have a forever occupation. Occupations are meant to be built with wood, not with concrete. They're meant to be temporary, they're meant to be short term, and and the occupying power has to return all, not some, all of the territory back to the people under occupation within a speedy period of time. None of this has happened. This is happening with the eyes of the world wide open as to what is emerging with respect to this. So on the question of accountability, this is probably the most painful aspect of what I encountered during my 6 years as Special Rapporteur, is the inability or unwillingness of the international community to put any of its resolutions and its laws in place with respect to Israel. Israel has learned that it can do pretty much as it wishes within certain pink lines of expanding the settlements, of confiscating more land, and of now being entirely opened, as the last several Israeli prime ministers have been, saying there's going to be no Palestinian state. We will control forever the land between the Jordan and the Mediterranean, with no expected pushback coming from the international community. In Resolution 2334, which was passed in December 2016, this is the only resolution that the Security Council has adopted critical of Israel in the past 13 years. The resolution said that the settlements are a flagrant violation under international law, and it asked the Secretary General to make a quarterly report, 4 times a year, a quarterly report to the Security Council as to whether Israel has obeyed the demand in the resolution that it completely cease all settlement, building, and expansion. And there's been 21 reports by the Secretary General or by the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process to the Security Council since that resolution was adopted. On each of the 21 occasions, most recently late last month, the Secretary General or the Special Coordinator said Israel has taken no steps to comply with this. There's also a provision in Resolution 2334 that in the same reports, the Secretary General or the Special Coordinator state whether the international community has taken any steps to differentiate between Israel and the occupied territories, i.e., has there been any steps towards accountability by the international community, particularly with respect to Israel's ongoing occupation. And in each of these 21 reports, the Secretary General or the Special Coordinator says no steps have been taken by the international community on any of these. So it's not a matter of ignorance. The Israeli occupation of Palestine, and to go back even further than 1967, this is the best documented conflict in the modern world by far. It's not the best reported, but it's the best documented. So no one has the excuse of standing up and saying, we didn't know. These facts were not available to us. There is many reports, not simply mine, but there are a number of reports coming out on a regular basis through UN bodies and channels, which document exactly what's going on in the occupied Palestinian territory, but to no effect. And it's largely the Western countries, Europe and North America, your country and my country, that have acted as laggards with respect to giving permission to Israel to keep continuing and deepening its occupation.
Amen. Robert Shareta thanks you for your service and asks, would Israel's behavior be considered racial or hate crime if it were really practiced like in your country and my country?
Well, if it's in my country or your country, I would hope both of us, and I would suspect both of us, would be brave enough to say this is wrong and this is apartheid. Sure. As a lawyer, the cornerstone of modern international law and modern domestic law is equality of all before the law, that each of us can be treated equally, and each of us would find the same respect for the whole entire basket of our rights in front of political leaders or in front of the courts. This obviously is not the case with respect to the Palestinians under occupation. They have rights, but they're denied those rights. The rights are plentiful under international human rights law and under the laws of occupation, but they are not obeyed by Israel. And in many ways, this is a human rights no-go zone that has been created with respect to this. And if I can just repeat myself, I'm astonished by the fact that the reporting that I and others in the UN system and the international human rights system make with respect to this, which will not move Western powers to rethink the relationship with Israel. We're in a funny state right now in 2022. I mentioned in my presentation that the last serious peace process collapsed in 2014, that had been initiated by the Secretary of State, John Kerry. We're in a situation now where there is no strategy by the international community to bring this occupation to an end. Some people say, well, there's no plan B. I'm saying there's no plan A. There's no strategy at all with respect to this. There's this hope, which you in the United States would say, it belongs to American football, of a Hail Mary pass, where the international community is saying we're not going to disturb the existing Israeli coalition for the next 3 or so years that they're in power. We're going to allow them to continue to entrench and deepen the occupation, because we don't want to fracture that coalition and open the door to Benjamin Netanyahu coming back. But this government of change of Israel is not. There's no change with respect to the occupation. Settlements increase. Settlement population winds up increasing. Human rights abuses are largely the same. There have been a few cosmetic changes, which one would welcome if they were actually leading towards a road to genuine peace and an end to the occupation, such as allowing more Palestinians to work in the occupied territory in Israel, or taking steps to try to improve the fiscal status of the Palestinian Authority. But we recognize that these are substitutes for a road to genuine peace, as opposed to part of a road to genuine peace. So it's I'm afraid that in 6 years' time, if you are kind enough to interview my successor as Special Rapporteur, as she completes her 6 years, I'm fearful that she would only be reporting even worse news to you than I'm reporting right now.
Michael Perez asks, to what extent is the existence of the Palestinian Authority and its cooperation with Israel responsible for this apartheid system that you are describing? Does addressing Israeli apartheid depend on the PA's calling it such and taking it up in the international system or before the international community?
Sure. It's my understanding that the Palestinian Authority does call this situation apartheid. I quoted in my report that the Palestinian ambassador to the United Nations in February, when addressing the Security Council, stated that it was apartheid in the occupied Palestinian Territory. So to that extent, I believe that is the position of the Palestinian Authority. Look, observers other than me have pointed out that the Palestinian Authority wears two hats. One hat is as a trying to be a genuine representative of the Palestinian people, and to try to assist on the domestic and international stage of realizing the aspirations of Palestinians for self-determination and for an end to the unwanted Israeli rule. And it makes this point repeatedly in international forums. The other hat it wears, of course, as some people point out, is as it has a strong security relationship with Israel and the Israeli military, and in fact, the only area, to my understanding, that the United States funds with respect to the Palestinian Authority is its security forces. It refuses funding to any other aspect of the functioning of the Palestinian Authority, and that's probably because that's the wish of Israel, the occupying power, that the security forces of the Palestinian Authority wind up being well funded, well trained, and accessible in order to be able to dampen the levels of violence towards Israelis in the occupied territories and Israel itself. So at some point, this contradiction of these two different hats that the Palestinian Authority wears are going to have to be addressed, and that's a question for the Palestinian people to want to make.
Another question came from Alina Karabanzic. In your opinion, what are the most effective methods for putting pressure on our own government, meaning the US government, to pass punitive measures against Israel, or at least divest funding to Israel? I know you did touch on some aspect of this. Do you care to add anything else to this?
Well, look, if there's ever going to be a change, a significant change in the actual foreign policy of countries in North America or in Europe with respect to the Israeli occupation. It's going to come from below. It's going to come from American, Canadian, European civil society being able to put pressure on their own governments to substantially change their positions. I mean, I have called for it in my reports, and these are the same kinds of recommendations that international human rights and domestic human rights organizations have been calling for, is an end to military aid to Israel, so long as the occupation continues, a review and hopefully an ending to preferential trade agreements with Israel. And certainly as a beginning step, I called for countries to refuse the entry of goods and services and products being produced in the Israeli settlements in the occupied territories coming into the international market. That seems to be, to me, to have to be the very minimum of what should be demanded in Western societies by civil society. Doing that, what I think would be a small but important, both symbolic but actual step towards making Israel itself and Israelis themselves realize that they can't have the best of both worlds of living in a country with a European standard of living while subjugating another people. That should be an impossibility, a political impossibility in our modern world. So those are the sorts of steps I think that civil society has to operate. And I recognize how difficult the political climate is in the United States. If anything, the single most important reason why the occupation continues and deepens is because of the steadfast American support for this, which is only possible, I think, because of the particular political system that you have in the United States. I'm far from claiming to have any particular expertise in American politics, but I do recognize the high mountain that civil society that is interested in wanting to see justice and equity for Palestinians and Israelis in Israel and Palestine, the high hill, the high mountain you have to climb in order to be able to achieve that. But your work is indispensable for the rest of us, because I would think that most countries, most Western countries, would take a better position on Israel and Palestine if they thought that they wouldn't run into diplomatic difficulties with the United States by taking tougher positions. So in many ways, while civil society continues its own work within their own countries, we do look to critical voices like yours in the United States to be able to help change the political climate in your own country.
Do you think, or do you link in your analysis, Western inaction that you just referred to the fact that the US and Canada are essentially white settler colonies, and the UK and France and other Western nations are white imperial or former white imperial nations? This is from Alawi Muhyiddin.
Look, there's a distinct relationship between that. It's a very good question. In my country, we obviously have a long path to travel with respect to truth and reconciliation with our Indigenous population. Indigenous population in Canada makes up about 5% of our population, and it's only in the last 5 to 10 years that the rest of Canada has begun to recognize and acknowledge, the horrors of history that white settler colonists visited upon Indigenous peoples as we came and confiscated their land and their heritage. We do make, in Canada, we do make small steps now. We have land acknowledgements as to the land from where we're living is Indigenous land. We are now taking very slow steps to try to come to the horrors of Aboriginal and Indigenous residential schools, which took Indigenous children away from their families. So the whole thought of settler colonialism is, we think of it here as settler colonialism, and we're open to arguments on that basis. One of the problems is the narrative is that we don't recognize Israel as a settler colony state in the same way as we recognize the United States or Canada or South Africa or Australia, New Zealand. There is still the narrative that this was European Jews returning to their land after 1800 years of exile, and and accidentally encountering another people who wound up living there, and made generous offers to those indigenous peoples, the Palestinian people, which they stubbornly refused to wind up accepting. So there's still that narrative that needs to be addressed, that Israel is a settler colony, like North America is, and should be recognized as such. And therefore, the true path has to be one of truth and reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians as a precondition to creating the kind of shared societies and shared prosperity that they're both capable of. Because, look, there are 14 million people now living between the Mediterranean and the Jordan. Nobody's leaving with respect to this, and these issues have to be addressed. You cannot have a society calling itself a liberal democracy, as many Israelis of conscience have raised, while subjugating another people, and subjugating other people within a settler colonial framework.
Naomi Weiss asks, why haven't Arab states rallied to assist the Palestinians? Do they view the Palestinians as terrorists, unable to work with the international community?
Well, again, that's something for people in the region to be able to address. But any of my interactions with civil society organizations in the Arab world tells me that their aspirations for justice and equality for the Palestinian people has not slackened at all. These were decisions made by the heads of largely undemocratic governments that are probably against the wishes of the population. To have this kind of cooperative, particularly economic and military relationship with Israel, while the question of Palestine goes unanswered. So I guess, from the little bit I understand of the region, I'm confident that that popular opinion is still on the side of wanting to see justice for the Palestinians, and the actions by some Arab governments is not representative of what their people think.
Mohammed Samhouri basically asks, with the death of the two-state solution and based on your own work over the past 6 years, what are your thoughts on the rights-based approach to the Palestinian question?
A rights-based approach is indispensable to a final just settlement and reconciliation of Israel and Palestine. We've lived now for more than 30 years with the Madrid-Oslo peace process. And the Madrid-Oslo peace process has unfortunately delivered one failure after another in terms of initiatives over the past 3 decades. And the failure is this: nothing in the Madrid-Oslo process centered human rights, international law, and a rights-based approach at the center of its activities. Basically, the approach of Madrid-Oslo was to say, parties, sit down at the bargaining table, we'll try to support both of you and see what you can bargain. But when the power imbalance between Israel and the Palestinians is so manifest as to make negotiations untenable, because there's very little that Palestinians can give Israel that it hasn't taken already or could take. So unless you have the predictable and strict boundaries of international law governing the process, which means the Palestinians don't have to negotiate over how many settlements it'll allow Israel to wind up keeping. All of the settlements are illegal. It doesn't have to negotiate with Israel over how much of the annexed land that Israel has taken should be kept by Israel, because all annexation is illegal and a crime of aggression under international law. That's what's missing in the Oslo-Madrid process, and that's what has to be centered in any future peace process. There's no hope for another peace process to be launched as long as international law and human rights are not at the very center of that process, rather than being peripheral or not mentioned at all.
We have a kind of a quick question from Philip Noyce. Will this program continue to be available on YouTube or elsewhere? Yes, it will be. It will be on the website of arabcenterdc.org, and it will be on our social media, including YouTube. So you will be able to watch it or refer your friends to watch it in the future. Let's conclude with this questions from William Gant. why would the world, or does the world community, vote to establish UN inquiries into Israel's apartheid practices, yet choose foreign policies that are opposite of UN recommendations?
Well, look, there's a tension in the international community's approach towards Israel and Palestine. Largely the North, Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, have a very tenuous approach towards Israel and Palestine, where they support Israel, and they're willing to forgive Israel a great deal, and they think that perhaps Israel's policy towards the Palestinians is regrettable, but they're willing to tolerate it probably for reasons of domestic politics. Much of the rest of the world, much of the developing world, I think has a much different perspective on Israel and Palestine, and sees the Palestinians as the occupation of Palestinians as a museum relic of 21st century colonialism. Something, we have an active case of colonialism in a post-colonial world. So it's probably the votes coming from a number of countries in the developing world at the UN Human Rights Council that created the Commission of Inquiry. The Commission of Inquiry would not have been created had it been left solely to Europe and North America. So that's where you see the tension in the world. And that's why, if you like, the question of Palestine can continue to be at the top of the agenda of the international community. It's because the developing world keeps it there.
Dr. Yara Asi asks, can you comment on the critique levied by many Palestinians that the major reports of apartheid, whether it's Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, or others, overlook or obscure the settler colonialism of Israeli land expansion and overall policies towards Palestinians?
Sure, I'll be brief on this. I've heard those critiques. I think anybody who has been involved in writing any of the major reports, including at Amnesty and at Human Rights Watch, is now cognizant of that particular issue. And I'm sure, because of those critiques, any discussions of apartheid in the context of settler colonialism those issues will be attached in future commentary. I don't dwell on the issue of settler colonialism in my own report. I do mention it, but probably because of space, I didn't have time to be able to elaborate upon it. But my sense is that as the discussion on apartheid continues to grow, that these critiques will be built into the future analysis of how apartheid is practiced, and will be an integral part of this. I know that, from my own time living as a young student many years ago in Africa and observing South Africa, that the issue of settler colonialism was an integral part of the analysis of apartheid in the 1970s and 1980s. So I'm sure this particular framework will continue to grow and will be part of future statements on apartheid.
Professor Michael Lynk, thank you so much for spending this time with us today. You have shed some light on some very serious issues. I hope that you in the audience have found this conversation beneficial to you in understanding this conflict and beyond. I would like to recommend to all of you who are watching this program to also check several recent articles by our colleagues at Arab Center pertaining to this issue, developments in Palestine and in Israel, and the interaction between both. We're in touch, so please you do the same. Thank you for your attendance today. Bye-bye.